It probably seemed like a fairy tale when 19-year-old Kathleen McCormack met Robert Durst in New York in 1972. Kathie had grown up in a blue-collar family. Robert, or Bobby, had grown up in one of the most wealthy and influential families in New York City. Friends later said it was love at first sight. Sadly, the fairy tale was not meant to be for Kathie and Bobbie Durst, for behind Bobbie's soft demeanor lurked another individual altogether, a man who would commit the most heinous crimes and for years, decades even, get away with them. Kathie McCormack would not witness the unraveling of Bobbie Durst, for on a rainy January evening in 1982, she disappeared forever.
Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that weave together paranormal aspects with murder mysteries, and they are all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com or at jrericksonauthor.com. They are in ebook, paperback, and audiobook.
Just a quick couple of things before we start today's episode. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get an episode out this month because I am on vacation in Florida with my family, but I managed to record this before we left. I have been having some sound issues with the podcast, and I did buy a new microphone, but I still haven't quite figured out how to make the audio quality better. One of these days I will have that figured out. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy today's two-part episode. Kathie McCormack was the youngest of 5 children, born to working-class parents in Long Island. Her family was close, her parents loving. Kathie's mother, Anne, stayed home with the kids while their father worked at a telephone company. During high school, Kathie started working in a dentist's office, and after she graduated, she moved to Manhattan and started a job as a dental hygienist. I believe Kathie's father died when she was young, but I was unable to find much information about him. While living in Manhattan in 1972, Kathie met her future husband, Robert, or Bob, or Bobbie Durst. I read multiple stories about how Kathie and Bob Durst met. In one story, she went to pay her rent at the building she'd moved into, a building that Bob's family owned, and he met Kathie while collecting rents. In another story, a mutual friend who also occupied the building introduced the two. Either way, several people who knew the couple described this meeting as love at first sight. They both had good senses of humor, though Bob's was more dry. They had the sort of famous opposites attract going on. thing going on, with Bob being shy, charming, but introverted, while Kathie was outgoing, talkative, and the life of the party. After only a couple of dates, Kathie agreed to move with Bob back to Vermont, where he owned a health food store. Kathie and Bob got married in a small ceremony on Bob's 31st birthday, April 12, 1973. At some point, Bob's father asked them to move back to the city, so they left their life and the health food store behind and returned to Manhattan. Kathie was beloved by her friends and family, beautiful, outgoing, and warm. She made friends easily and lit up every room she walked into. She was also intelligent and driven. Kathie was also very attractive, with long, straight blonde hair. She'd even done some runway modeling in high school. Initially, Bob and Kathie's relationship seemed like a dream come true. Kathie's brother James would later say Bob swept Kathie off of her feet. At the time of their meeting, Kathie was 19 years old and Bob Durst was 29. And as I said, he owned a health food store and he also did real estate investing with his father. Kathie was bubbly, outgoing, and happy. Long, straight blonde hair, big brown eyes, and a radiant smile. Bobbie, on the contrary, was sullen, often sitting in the corner, socializing only with his own close friends. He may have liked Kathie's vivacious personality, but more than that, he seemed to like his ownership of the pretty young woman. Robert would later say their marriage began to unravel after he insisted Kathie have an abortion. Whether this was the start of their downfall is hard to say, but it surely was impactful for Kathie. When Kathie found out she was pregnant, Durst was furious, and he insisted that she get rid of the baby, either an abortion or a divorce, he told her. She got the abortion, but she was changed, and after that she enrolled in nursing school, where she excelled, graduating with a 4.0 GPA. She then went on to medical school with the hopes of becoming a doctor, maybe a pediatrician. After the abortion, Kathie had realized she needed to start creating her own life. Without a career, Bob Durst owned her, and despite his enormous wealth, he was not a generous man. He was quite miserly, and he only allowed Kathie small amounts of money, basically the minimum to live on. Their marriage began to go rapidly downhill, but again, it's entirely possible it had started to fall apart long before the abortion. At some point, Bob started to hit Kathie, and by some accounts, that abuse had begun shortly after they got married. In addition to the hitting, he expected to know where she was at all times. There seemed to be a lot of factors that put Kathie at a disadvantage in her marriage. Bob was 10 years older than Kathie. Again, when she met, he was 29 and she was 19 and had barely begun her life. This created an immediate imbalance of power. Add to that Robert Durst came from one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in New York City, and Kathie did not come from money. So she relied heavily on Durst for all of her needs. Codependence and abuse often create instances where the victim of the abuse feels unable to leave. Their identity has become enmeshed with their abuser. Even in healthy relationships, this exists. We become dependent on our partners, deeply intertwined with them. In Kathie's case, add physical, mental, and emotional abuse and a massive discrepancy between the distribution of their wealth. She came into the marriage with no money, and despite the assumption that a wife would be owed some amount of the marital assets, it's not hard to believe that a wealthy, powerful husband who was also controlling could easily have convinced her otherwise, essentially saying, if you leave, you'll have nothing. Another issue was Bob's relationship with Kathie's family. He put little to no effort into getting to know her mother or siblings. Whether this was a social ineptitude on his part or disdain for the people he deemed lesser than him is hard to say. For a person who wants control, isolating their partner from their family is another effective way to get it. It's clear that Bob Durst struggled to fit in. In his younger years, he was described as a loner. And again, despite the wealth in his family, Bob Durst's father was also quite miserly from what I read. So clearly some of Bob's refusal to spend money arose from his dad. In order to properly convey Kathie's story, we need to take a closer look at Robert Durst. Robert, or Bobby, was born to Seymour and Beatrice Durst on April 12, 1943, in Scarsdale, New York. He was the oldest of 4 children. And as I said, the Durst family was a very wealthy and powerful family in New York. They had bought up large portions of New York real estate. At 7 years old, Bob's mother, Beatrice, died tragically and mysteriously. What exactly occurred is unclear, though the prevailing story seems to be that she committed suicide by jumping from the roof of her family's home in Scarsdale. Robert would later say that he witnessed his mother's death. In The Jinx, which is an HBO documentary that I'll talk about later in the podcast, Robert claimed that the night his mother died, Seymour, his father, woke him up and led him to a hallway to look out a window where he could see his mother perched on the edge of the roof. A different story was told in the book The Deadly Secret that was written by journalist Matt Birkbeck. In that book, which was told according to Matt based on police reports from the time, the story was that Robert woke and looked for his mother, spotting her on the roof and running to where his father, Seymour, was at in the house. He told his father that his mother was on the roof. The police were alerted, but as a rescuer climbed toward Beatrice, she suddenly plummeted to her death. Seymour Durst later claimed that she'd had an asthma attack earlier that day and had reacted poorly to the medication, causing her to act erratically. Her death was determined to be an accident. However, the prevailing story in the neighborhood around the Durst home, as well as in the Durst family itself, was that Beatrice had killed herself. Douglas Durst, Robert's next youngest brother, told a different story as well. He claimed that the night their mother died, all of the children were woken from their beds and whisked out of the home to a neighbor's house. He said that none of them, including Robert, witnessed their mother's death. After Beatrice died, the Durst family had a series of nannies or governesses. Their father, Seymour, never remarried. There was also a great deal of sibling rivalry between Bob and his brother Douglas. So going back to 1982. In 1982, things had gotten uglier in Kathie and Bob's marriage. Abuse, infidelities, withholding money. Despite all the issues, Kathie hadn't left, in part because she was only months away from graduating from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and she also wanted a proper divorce settlement, which Bobby wouldn't agree to. So let's rewind back the clock to Sunday, January 31st, 1982. 29-year-old Kathie Durst was spending the weekend with her husband Bobby at their lake house in South Salem, New York. Kathie called her close friend Gilberta Najeme and told her she was frustrated with Bobby. Gilberta invited Kathie over. She said she was having a small dinner party with family, but she knew Kathie was desperate to get away from the house and to get away from Bob. Gilberta was well aware of the issues in Kathie's marriage. Kathie had told Gilberta, as well as many of her other friends, that Bob was abusive, and most of them had encouraged her to leave him. At Gilberta's house that afternoon, Kathie was upset, as she had been for months. As the day wore on, Bobby started to call incessantly, demanding that Kathie return home. Kathie finally agreed to leave. Gilberta walked Kathie to her car, and they decided to meet the following day for dinner in New York City. Kathie also said something that would haunt Gilberta for the rest of her life. Kathie essentially told her, "If anything happens to me, Bobby did it." Those would be the last known words anyone would hear from Kathie Durst. She drove into the dark, rainy January night and seemed to vanish. The following evening, Gilberta waited for Kathie at the Lion's Den Tavern in New York City, where they were supposed to meet for dinner. Kathie never showed. Gilberta was immediately scared and started making calls to Kathie's home in South Salem, as well as to the penthouse that her and Bobbie owned in New York and an additional apartment in New York. She didn't find Kathie at any of these locations. Gilberta then started calling their other friends. The resounding sense among Kathie's friends was that Bobbie had done something to Kathie. 5 days would pass before Robert Durst walked into the New York City Police Department to file a missing persons report. He walked up to Detective Michael Struck, who took an immediate disliking to Durst because the man had the audacity to bring his dog into the police station. Durst also dropped a magazine on the detective's desk with a headline that read, quote, "The Men Who Own New York." Robert told Detective Struck that the previous Sunday his wife Kathie had returned to their South Salem home after attending a party at a friend's house. They had an argument, and later he drove her to the bus station, where she caught a bus back to New York City. He then claimed to have spoken to her on the phone later that night after she'd returned to their penthouse apartment in Manhattan. When Struck asked Bob why he'd waited so long to report Kathie missing, Bob told him that she was in medical school, and since they had the home in South Salem, the penthouse, and an additional apartment in New York, they sometimes went several days without seeing each other. Durst claimed he and Kathie weren't having marital problems. Struck wasn't quite sure what to think about the slightly disheveled man who'd come into his office. He had the sense that despite appearances, Bob Durst had money, and the revealing of the magazine about the powerful men in New York had been some kind of hint. Struck wondered if one of the men on the cover was related to Durst, and he was right, because Seymour Durst was on the cover of that magazine. After Durst left, Struck's initial thoughts were that Kathie had probably taken off. However, he started to look into Kathie's disappearance. During the interview, Durst had claimed that he and Kathie weren't having marital problems, but when Struck started to call Kathie's family, including her brother James, he learned that they'd been having major problems and that Bob Durst was often violent toward his wife. James recalled an incident that had happened a previous Christmas when Kathie and Bob, along with her siblings, were at their mother's house. Bob wanted to leave the party and Kathie did not. Bob ended up grabbing Kathie by the hair and jerking her off the couch in front of her entire family. James told Struck that he'd wanted to do something, but that Kathie sort of smoothed everything over and left the party with Durst. Detective Struck also called the dean at Kathie's medical school. The dean told her that the previous Monday, the day after Kathie was last seen, Kathie had called in sick to school. Based on everything he was hearing, Struck continued to think that Kathie had probably gotten fed up with her marriage and taken off. The problem was that there were aspects of the case that niggled at him. This was a blue-collar woman married to a millionaire. Why would she just disappear? Why wouldn't she fight to get a divorce settlement? Secondly, she was only months away from graduating from medical school. Yes, she'd been having some problems in school, he discovered, and potentially even failing some of her classes. But even so, she was close to becoming a medical doctor, a career she'd worked hard to achieve. It just didn't make sense that she'd walk away from all that. A day or two after Bob Durst filed the initial report, he called Struck a second time and told him he'd thought of something else. He said that Kathie was spending a great deal of time with a cocaine dealer, that she had a major cocaine problem, and she may have been having an affair with the dealer. Struck took notes and made a note to call the person whose name Bob Durst said was Michael Burns. When Struck contacted Michael Burns, he did admit that he knew Kathie, that he'd met her at a party. However, he insisted that he was not a cocaine dealer or user and said that he and Kathie were not having an affair. Bob Durst had claimed that he had spoken to Kathie the night she returned to Manhattan. And Struck later told Durst that they would be able to tell by phone records if he had, in fact, called Kathie that night. Bob quickly changed his story. He claimed that he hadn't called Kathie from the South Salem house. Instead, he'd called her from a payphone that Struck later discovered was nearly 3 miles away from their South Salem home. That was the closest payphone to their home. Durst claimed to have been out walking their dog. This struck the detective as odd because remember, this was January 31st in New York. It was cold, dark, and rainy that night. A 3-mile walk to a payphone would have resulted in a 6-mile round trip. And this was late at night. I think it was actually the early morning hours that he claimed to have made this phone call. Now, I will mention that it is true that Kathie Durst was using cocaine when she disappeared, and she had been using it regularly for some time. Again, this is the early 80s in New York, and realistically, cocaine was kind of a recreational drug in circles of wealthy people at that period of time. That being said, nearly all of Kathie's friends said that the cocaine use as well as heavy drinking really began and continued because of her toxic marriage with Bob Durst. Detective Struck later visited Bob at the penthouse apartment that he had shared in New York with Kathie. While they were at the apartment, Bob told Detective Struck that the night Kathie went missing, she'd gone to a party at Gilberta's, a woman he strongly disliked, who he also believed was a lesbian who was interested in Kathie. He also said that Gilberta had a very bad influence on Kathie and supplied her with large amounts of drugs. Bob claimed that that was part of the reason they had fought the Sunday that she disappeared, because after she had gone to Gilberta's, she had been riled up and ready to come home and fight. When Struck asked Bob if he'd ever beaten Kathie, Bob insisted he had never hit her and that he'd had nothing to do with her disappearance. That day, as Detective Struck was leaving the building, he encountered a man working the elevator. His name was Eddie Lopez. Struck asked Lopez if he'd seen Kathie the previous Sunday. Lopez said yes, he'd taken her up in the elevator to her apartment, and later he'd taken a man he didn't know to her apartment as well. Lopez's story corroborated Bob's account of Kathie returning to New York that evening. Struck asked Lopez to come into the station and helped create a composite sketch. The composite was created and it showed a younger Hispanic male. This composite was shown to everyone who knew Kathie, and no one recognized him. Struck and other investigators also searched the penthouse in New York as well as the building, but they found no sign of Kathie. Around this time, reporters got wind of her disappearance. Headlines started popping up all over the city about the missing woman. As the pressure increased, Robert Durst sort of disappeared into the shadows. He stopped speaking to Detective Struck. He also asked his good friend Susan Berman to be his spokesperson. And Susan Berman's potential involvement in Kathie's disappearance will become prominent later in this story. When Kathie vanished, her friends and family immediately focused on Bob Durst. They'd witnessed firsthand how their marriage had fallen apart. Kathie was honest and open with her friends about what was happening in her marriage. She told them that Bobby was beating her, that he was controlling and manipulative. Despite his enormous wealth, he withheld money even for basic necessities, and she often had to borrow money from friends. She also told many of them, in no uncertain terms, that if anything ever happened to her, to assume it was foul play and that Bobbie was behind it. In their desperation for answers, Gilberta and Ellen Strauss, another of Kathie's friends, went to the house in South Salem and picked through the trash. They discovered that Bobbie had started throwing away Kathie's things, including her medical books and clothes. They also found a disturbing note written by Bob, a list that read, quote, town dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, shovel, or question mark. Gilberta threw a rock through the window and snuck into the house, fearing that she might find Kathie dead inside. She did not. There was no sign that Kathie had been murdered in the house, but she did notice that the house was cleaner than usual. Kathie's friends were convinced that she had never made it out of South Salem. The Sunday after Kathie went missing, Gilberta took the exact same train from South Salem to New York. Carrying a photo of Kathie, she asked the train conductor and other passengers on board if any of them had seen Kathie that previous Sunday. Not a single witness remembered seeing her, and many of the people on that train were regular commuters that would have been riding it the previous Sunday. Ellen Strauss, who was an attorney and had met Kathie while they were in college, started calling and visiting psychiatric hospitals, even going bed to bed on the chance that Kathie had been admitted with amnesia or some other mental breakdown. She found no trace of her. Gilberta, Ellen, and another of their good friends, Eleanor, went to the NYPD and confronted Detective Struck, demanding to know what was happening with the investigation. They also insisted that Bob Durst was involved in Kathie's disappearance. They told Struck that Kathie had told all of them on multiple occasions that Durst was violent and that if anything should ever happen to her, he was behind it. Detective Struck spoke with other people in Kathie's life, including their neighbors at their South Salem house. Their neighbors' last names were Mayers. Kathie and Bob regularly got together with the Mayers for barbecues or dinners. Robert had told Detective Struck that the night he dropped Kathie off at the train station, he had returned to the Mayers' home and had a drink with them. However, when Struck interviewed the Mayers, they said no, that was not true. Bob had never been there. Ruth Mayer also told Struck that Kathie had been confiding in her, that Bob was having an affair with a woman named Prudence Farrow. This affair had gone on for an extended period of time. Prudence at one point was even calling Kathie and demanding that she leave Bob. Ruth also shared that Kathie told her that Bob was hitting her. Kathie confessed to Ruth and their friends while quite intoxicated one night that she had taken papers from the Durst organization that she believed proved there was illegal activity going on within the company. Kathie intended to use those papers to force Bob into giving her a proper divorce settlement. This had worried the Mayers, and Kathie had admitted to them that she too was scared, and like she'd told so many of her friends before, she told them that if anything happened to her, to expect it was foul play and that Bob was involved. Struck was struggling to make sense of all the information that had come in about Kathie's disappearance. On the one hand, Kathie's friends were insisting she never made it out of South Salem, and some of Bob's own story did not add up. On the other hand, he'd spoken to an elevator man at the penthouse in New York who claimed to have taken Kathie to her apartment on the last day she was seen alive. Not to mention, he had also spoken to the dean at her medical school who said Kathie had called in sick the following morning. In the weeks after Kathie vanished, Struck went with Kathie's sister to retrieve some of the jewelry from her and Bob's penthouse. And I do have in my notes that it was from the penthouse, but I also thought I had read it was from their apartment at one point, so I'm not positive on that. They learned while in the building that Robert had been throwing out so much of Kathie's stuff, it had clogged the garbage chute in his building. While in the Durst apartment, Struck noticed a very expensive-looking Burberry coat that was hanging in the closet. It was wrinkled and deformed, as if someone had put it through a washing machine. Later, Struck would return to the apartment again, and he would notice that the coat was gone. It took months for Detective Struck to get telephone records from the Durst household and businesses. When he did, Struck discovered something interesting. Bob Durst had made 2 collect phone calls from a payphone in Ship Bottom, New Jersey, in the days after Kathie disappeared. Struck knew that these calls came from Bob because he spoke with the receptionist at the office, who said the only person who called the office collect was Bob. Now, what's interesting about Ship Bottom is that it's near a place known as the Pine Barren, a massive, over 1 million acre nature reserve, allegedly popular with the mob for a place where you can easily dispose of bodies that will never be found. Again, it was January in New York when Kathie disappeared, which means the ground was frozen. However, the sandy ground of the Pine Barrens would allow someone to dig even when it was cold out. When confronted about the calls, Robert claimed he had not been to Ship Bottom on those days and he had not made those calls, though again, a secretary at the Durst organization stated otherwise. Another interesting fact was that those calls were made from a laundromat, which made Detective Struck think about that odd, misshapen coat that had been in the Durst apartment and then vanished shortly thereafter. As Struck considered all of the evidence, he became convinced that Bob Durst had in fact murdered Kathie and likely disposed of her body in the Pine Barrens. He took all of the evidence he'd compiled to Roger Hayes, the assistant district attorney in New York. Essentially, there was a lot of evidence. The problem, it was all circumstantial, and that was what Hayes said to Struck. Without a body or a crime scene, it was highly unlikely they would be able to get a conviction. An additional issue was that the Durst family had an exorbitant amount of money, which means they would be hiring some of the most powerful and convincing attorneys that money could buy. If their case wasn't strong enough, Bob Durst would get off, and they would never have a chance to retry him because of double jeopardy. Essentially, Hayes told Struck they really could not go forward with the case without solid evidence. Other oddities occurred in the case after Kathie Durst went missing. Robert's own family never stepped forward to offer any assistance. Robert himself had stopped speaking to police in the weeks after Kathie vanished, and he hired a criminal defense attorney. His family were basically silent on the matter. Despite their enormous resources, they never offered the McCormack family any assistance in helping to find Kathie. Worse still, they offered no sympathy. James McCormack, Kathie's brother, later said that not a single Durst family member reached out to them after Kathie disappeared. Struck and other New York police investigators felt more and more that Robert Durst was involved in Kathie's disappearance. They simply couldn't amass enough evidence to prove it. A major frustration for Kathie's friends and family was that police never searched the South Salem house for evidence of a crime. Due to the eyewitness accounts of Kathie's doorman and the college dean, police always assumed that Kathie made it back to the city before she disappeared, though again, her friends never thought so. Nearly 20 years would pass without any movement on the case of Kathie Durst. Then in November of 1999, New York State Police investigator Joe Becerra received a phone call with a tip. The man told Becerra he had information on the cold case murder of Kathie Durst. The tipster was a former convict who'd been arrested for public exposure. He told Becerra that his older brother used to be married to the Durst South Salem housekeeper. This housekeeper, though younger than Kathie, had become quite good friends with Kathie before she disappeared. She cleaned the South Salem house after Kathie vanished, and she had told her then husband, the tipster's brother, that Robert had murdered Kathie at the house. She also claimed she had seen blood on the dishwasher. Becerra was intrigued by this tip, and he contacted the NYPD for the case file on Kathie Durst. As he read through the file, which was quite massive, he really wasn't sure what to think. But he started re-interviewing witnesses, including Eddie Lopez, the man who claimed he took Kathie up in the elevator to her penthouse apartment that Sunday night in 1982. Now, in 1999, Eddie claimed he didn't remember what happened that night. He wasn't sure if he'd seen Kathie at all. Other staff at the building also told Becerra that Eddie had often told lies, and he had a drinking problem. People believed he may have made up the story about seeing Kathie to cover the fact that he wasn't where he was supposed to be that night. There was also the possibility that Lopez was paid, though I don't believe there was evidence of that. The original case had largely been based on the theory that Kathie made it back to New York City that Sunday night, but Becerra was starting to doubt that she had. Becerra wanted to try to build his case, and he went to the then district attorney, Janine Pirro. She gave him the go-ahead. Becerra reached out to Kathie's family and friends, who reacted with mixed emotions. Kathie's disappearance had left many of them with gaping emotional wounds that created rifts in their family, particularly in the McCormack family. In the book, A Deadly Secret, Matt Birkbeck mentioned how distraught Kathie's sister Mary was after she disappeared, and how for many, many years she worked to try and find out what happened to her sister. They were filled with doubt on some level that anything was going to be done in Kathie's case, but they were also hopeful that Joe Becerra would find new evidence and finally prove that Bob had in fact murdered Kathie. Becerra wanted to keep the reopening of the case under wraps. He didn't want Robert Durst to be aware that they were quietly looking into Kathie's disappearance. Unfortunately, his plan was foiled in November of 2000 when a reporter exposed that police were searching the South Salem property. Investigators searched the Durst's former home in South Salem, which was now under new ownership. They removed any evidence they thought might be helpful, but they really didn't find anything that proved Durst had killed Kathie in the house. They even sent divers into Lake Truesdale, the lake that the South Salem house was situated on. But again, they found no evidence of Kathie. An investigator also tried to reenact Kathie's movements from that January night when she vanished, including taking the train ride into New York. The investigator found out that the timeline was basically impossible based on Robert's claims that Kathie had left Gilberta's at a certain time, arrived home. Supposedly she'd had some wine and dinner. They'd had a fight of some sort, and then he had taken her to this train. But again, an investigator tried to reenact those exact movements, and the timeline just did not line up. Becerra started trying to track down Robert Durst, who had seemingly fallen off the radar. He learned that in 1994, Robert Durst was bypassed as the successor in the Durst lucrative real estate business. Though Bob was the eldest son, it was his younger brother Douglas who was given the reins. Douglas would later say this was in part due to Bob's tendency to urinate in waste paper baskets at the office. But clearly, there were other things off about the eldest Durst child. Bob was enraged when Douglas was given control of the company. He cut off nearly all contact with his family, showing up only briefly to visit his father, Seymour Durst, after the man had a stroke. When Seymour died shortly after the stroke, Bob did not attend his funeral. Bob might have faded from the spotlight after Kathie's case had gone cold all those years ago, but the man would end up in the spotlight again and again, each time a violent death seemed to be at the center, and the focus was always on Bob. So this is where I'm going to end the first part of this two-part episode. You can catch the next episode and find out about the future murders that Robert Durst was accused of or participated in part 2.
If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.